They stopped searching for a man because they were sure he was already dead, until a dog led them to a cabin no one had entered in 50 years. On the night before Christmas, a brutal snowstorm swallowed the Wyoming mountains whole. Daniel Mercer vanished into the forest, and by morning, hope was already gone. But deep in the frozen silence, his German shepherd refused to leave. What that dog found would change everything. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. The storm came in faster than anyone had predicted. By late afternoon on December 22nd, the sky over the Wyoming mountains had already turned a heavy shade of iron gray. The wind moved low at first, whispering through the pine trees, carrying that quiet warning the locals knew too well. But by nightfall, it wasn't a warning anymore. It was a wall. Snow didn't fall. It attacked. Sheets of white slammed sideways through the forest, swallowing trails, burying fences, erasing everything that proved a man had ever been there. Temperatures dropped fast, the kind of cold that didn't just freeze skin. It reached deeper, into bone, into breath, into the will to keep going. That was the night Daniel Mercer disappeared. "Say it again," Sheriff Dalton Hayes said, pulling his coat tighter as he leaned into the radio. Static cracked between every word. "Last sighting was just past the Mercer property line," the dispatcher replied. "Neighbor saw him heading north. Around 3:40 p.m., he had the dog with him." Dalton closed his eyes for a second. North. Nobody went north in a storm like this. "Any tracks?" he asked. "Gone. Our wind picked up an hour later. We've got nothing." Dalton looked out into the white chaos beyond the searchlights. Even standing 10 feet from the trucks, shapes were already fading, swallowed by the storm like they had never existed. "Keep the teams moving," he said, though his voice had lost its edge. "Grid search. Stay in pairs." He released the radio slowly. Behind him, a handful of volunteers stood hunched together, their faces hidden behind scarves and frost. Farmers, mechanics, a couple of younger guys from town who still believed you could outwork nature if you tried hard enough. But tonight, nature wasn't something you worked against. Tonight, it decided. One of the volunteers, a man named Carl Benson, stepped closer, his voice low. "Sheriff, we've covered everything within 2 miles. Also, if he kept going north..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Dalton nodded once, his jaw tight. "We keep going." Carl hesitated. "With respect, sir, this storm's getting worse. Wind chills dropping below -20. We're risking more people out here." Dalton didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted again to the darkness between the trees. Somewhere out there, a man was either fighting to stay alive or already gone. A gust of wind roared through the clearing, shaking the searchlights, making them flicker. For a brief moment, everything dimmed, like the world itself had taken a breath. Then the howling started. It cut through the storm like something alive. A long, deep, aching sound that rose and fell, not random, not wild, intentional. Every head turned at once. "There," someone whispered. Dalton lifted his flashlight and pointed toward the tree line. "You hear that?" Another howl answered, closer this time. Not a wolf. Too steady, too controlled. "That's Mercer's dog," Carl said. "That's Atlas." The name hung in the air like something heavier than it should have been. Atlas. Everyone in town knew that dog. Big German shepherd. Smart, quiet, always walking half a step ahead of Daniel, like he was watching the world for him. Loyal in a way that made people uncomfortable. Because Daniel Mercer hadn't spoken much since his wife died. Hadn't smiled. Hadn't shown up to anything. He moved through town like a ghost, and the only thing that seemed to anchor him to the living world was that dog. Another howl. Longer this time. Closer. Dalton's grip tightened around his flashlight. Move out. I'll follow that sound. They pushed into the trees, boots crunching through fresh layers of snow that erased their steps as quickly as they made them. The wind clawed at their coats, slipping through seams, biting at exposed skin. "Atlas!" Carl shouted. "Hey, boy!" The only answer was the storm, and then a shape, low, moving. Dalton swung the beam of his flashlight forward. The dog stood there, half hidden by swirling snow. His fur was coated in frost, his chest rising and falling hard, breath visible in sharp bursts. His eyes caught the light, bright, focused, unafraid. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Dalton stepped forward slowly. "Atlas!" The dog didn't come. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He just stood there and stared. "Where is he, boy?" Dalton asked, his voice softer now. Atlas turned his head. Yes, then he looked back at them and took a step deeper into the forest. Carl frowned. "He's not coming to us." Dalton's stomach tightened. "No," he said quietly. "He's not." Another step. The dog paused again, looking back, waiting. "He wants us to follow," Carl said. Dalton didn't respond immediately. His instincts, honed over years, pressed against his ribs like a warning. This storm, this darkness, this kind of cold. You didn't go deeper in, not unless you had no other choice. He looked at the dog again. Atlas didn't move, didn't panic, didn't act like an animal lost in a storm. He stood there like something else entirely, like a guide. Dalton exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "We follow him. Stay tight. Nobody breaks formation." They moved, step by step, deeper into the trees. The wind grew louder. Branches creaked overhead, and the path, if there had ever been one, was gone. Atlas moved ahead of them, never too far, always just enough to stay in sight. Every few seconds he looked back, making sure they were still there. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time didn't behave normally in storms like this. Then suddenly, Atlas stopped, dead still. Dalton raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. "What is it?" Carl whispered. Before Dalton could answer, Atlas let out another howl, shorter this time, sharper, not calling anymore, announcing. Dalton stepped forward, pushing past a low branch heavy with snow, and then he saw it. Not a body, not a man, just the endless stretch of white and shadow between trees. Nothing. His chest tightened. Carl stepped beside him, scanning the darkness. "Oh, there's nothing here." The wind surged again, nearly knocking one of the volunteers off balance. Dalton looked down. No tracks, no signs, no movement. Only the dog standing alone in the storm. Atlas didn't look confused. He didn't look lost. He looked certain. And that was what scared Dalton the most. He turned slowly back to his team. The truth settled in his chest, heavy and cold. "They weren't searching for a man anymore," he said quietly. No one spoke. No one argued. They were searching for a body. The storm swallowed the rest of his words. And somewhere beyond the trees, Atlas lifted his head again and howled into the night. The sound carried farther than it should have. Even through the wind, even through the storm that swallowed everything else, it lingered, low, aching, and steady. And it wasn't the cry of an animal lost. It was the cry of something that refused to leave. Sheriff Dalton Hayes stood frozen for a moment longer, watching the dog's silhouette blur into the snow. Then the wind surged again, and the world snapped back into motion. "We're pulling back," he said, voice firm now. "Storm's getting worse. We regroup at first light." No one argued. They couldn't afford to. One by one, the search party turned away, their lights disappearing behind sheets of snow, their footsteps erased almost as soon as they were made. But Atlas didn't follow. He stood where he was, unmoving, watching them leave. And when the last beam of light vanished into the storm, he turned and walked deeper into the forest. Alone. Daniel Mercer had never planned to survive that night. That much was true. Yet the decision hadn't come all at once. It had built slowly, quietly, over months, maybe years, a weight pressing down on him, one small piece at a time, until even breathing felt like work. The farm had been the last thing holding him together. It wasn't much. A weathered house, a few acres of land, fences that leaned more than they stood. But it had been theirs, his and Claire's. He could still see her out there sometimes, standing by the fence line in the early morning light, hair pulled back, laughing at something he couldn't remember anymore. That was the cruel part. He could remember the way she laughed, but not what made her laugh. The accident had taken that too. It had been raining that day. Roads slick, visibility low. A truck had crossed the line just for a second. That was all it took. Daniel had been overseas when it happened. He didn't make it back in time to say goodbye. Didn't make it back in time for anything. By the time he stood at her grave, the world already felt like something distant, something he wasn't fully part of anymore. People had tried at first. Neighbors brought food. The sheriff stopped by more than once. Even Carl Benson had offered to help fix the roof after a storm rolled through that spring. Daniel had nodded, said thank you, and then slowly stopped answering the door, stopped answering calls, stopped showing up. It was easier that way. Out in the quiet, there were no questions, no reminders, no pity. Just the wind, the land, and Atlas. He'd found the dog at a shelter just outside Cheyenne. Or maybe the dog had found him. Atlas had been bigger than the others, quieter, but he didn't bark when Daniel walked in, didn't jump or press against the cage. He just watched, the same way he did now, like he understood something no one else did. Daniel hadn't meant to take him home that day, but when he turned to leave, something in his chest tightened. And when he looked back, Atlas was still watching him. That had been enough. The first winter after Claire was gone had been the hardest, not because of the cold, but because of the silence. Nights stretched longer, days felt empty. The house, once filled with small sounds, small movements, had become something hollow. Daniel would sit at the kitchen table long after dark, staring at nothing, the clock ticking louder than it should have. Atlas would lie nearby, head resting on his paws, never too close, but never far. Waiting, always waiting. There were nights Daniel didn't sleep at all. Nights when the memories came back sharp and unforgiving. The desert heat, the sound of distant explosions, the faces of men he couldn't forget. And then, worse than all of it, the image of Claire standing in that same kitchen, smiling, alive, and gone. He'd wake up gasping, heart racing, hands shaking. Atlas would already be there, sometimes pressing against him, sometimes just sitting, watching, grounding him, pulling him back. Over time, Daniel stopped trying to fight it. The past didn't leave. It just settled in, like snow layer after layer, until everything underneath felt buried. The letter from the bank came in early December, final notice. They gave him 2 weeks. 2 weeks to pay what he didn't have, or walk away from the only place that still held what was left of his life. Daniel read it once, then again, then folded it neatly and placed it on the table. Atlas watched him from across the room. Daniel didn't say anything, didn't curse, didn't react. He just sat there, still, like something inside him had finally stopped. On the morning of December 22nd, he didn't pack much. A small bag, a canteen, a few supplies. Not enough to last long. Not enough to survive a storm, but enough to leave. Atlas followed him to the door. Of course he did. Daniel paused, his hand resting on the handle. "You don't have to come," he said quietly. The dog tilted his head. Daniel gave a faint, humorless breath. "Yeah, I know." He opened the door. The cold hit instantly, sharp, clean, final. For a second, he stood there, looking out across the land, fences buried under snow, the barn barely visible through the wind, the sky already turning darker than it should have been. This had been his home, and now it wasn't. He stepped forward. Atlas moved beside him, and together, they walked into the storm. Hours later, as the wind erased their tracks and the world closed in around them, Daniel began to understand something. He wasn't just leaving the land behind. He was leaving everything. The memories, the pain, the weight he had carried for too long. Out here, in the cold, in the white silence. It could all finally end. He stumbled once, catching himself against a tree. Atlas circled back immediately, pressing against his leg, steadying him. Daniel looked down at the dog. "You should have stayed," he muttered. Atlas didn't move, didn't step away, just stayed there. Like always. Daniel shook his head and kept walking, but the storm was getting worse. The trees blurred together. The path, if there had ever been one, was gone. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the numbness, a small, stubborn part of him began to resist. Not because he wanted to live, but because he wasn't alone. Atlas moved ahead again, stopping every few steps, looking back, waiting, leading. Daniel frowned slightly. "That's not the way back," he said under his breath. But the dog didn't change direction, didn't hesitate. He kept moving forward, into the unknown. And after a moment, Daniel followed. The wind hit him harder the deeper they went. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was force, as a constant, relentless push that bent the trees and filled the air with a blinding swirl of white. Snow cut across his face like sand, sharp and stinging, forcing his eyes half shut as he tried to keep Atlas in sight. The dog moved with purpose, not wandering, not guessing. Purpose. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. Atlas wasn't circling, he wasn't hesitating, he wasn't doing what a dog normally would when lost in unfamiliar terrain during a storm. He was choosing a direction and sticking to it. "Hey!" Daniel called out, his voice rough against the wind. "That's not—" The gust swallowed his words. Atlas kept going. Daniel slowed, planting his boots into the thickening snow, trying to orient himself. He turned his head, scanning the trees behind him. Everything looked the same now. Dark trunks, white blur, now shadows swallowed by the storm. No trail, no landmarks. Nothing to lead him back. A flicker of unease crept into his chest. He turned forward again. Atlas had stopped, standing 10 yards ahead, half hidden in the white, watching him, waiting. Daniel let out a slow breath, his chest tightening. "This isn't right," he muttered, but his legs moved anyway. Step by step, he followed. time lost meaning out there. Minutes stretched, or maybe hours. The storm had a way of folding everything into one endless moment. No beginning, no end, just movement and cold, and breath turning to frost in the air. Daniel's boots grew heavier with every step. Snow packed into the seams, numbing his feet, creeping upward. His fingers, even inside gloves, began to lose feeling. His breath shortened, sharp, uneven. The first signs, but he knew them well. He'd seen men pushed to the edge before. He'd felt it himself in a different place, under a different sky. But cold was colder here, and there was no one else coming. He stumbled, caught himself on a low branch. Atlas turned instantly, moving back toward him, pressing his body against Daniel's leg as if to steady him. "I'm fine," Daniel said automatically, though his voice lacked conviction. Atlas didn't move away. Daniel looked down at him. The dog's eyes were locked on his, focused, intent. There was something there Daniel couldn't quite name. Not fear, not confusion. Something else. Something determined. Daniel exhaled slowly and pushed forward again. The wind shifted, just slightly, but enough to change everything. One moment it roared from the west, slamming into the trees. The next, as it cut from the north, sharper, colder, slicing through the forest in long, violent bursts. Daniel turned instinctively, trying to shield his face. That was when he realized. He didn't know where he was anymore, not even close. The land had changed. Or maybe it just looked that way now. Trees stood closer together here, thicker, older. The ground dipped slightly, uneven beneath the snow, forcing his steps to slow. "This isn't right," he said again, louder this time. Atlas didn't respond. He kept moving. Daniel's chest tightened. A different kind of fear began to rise. Not sharp, not immediate, but slow and creeping. He had lived on this land for years. He knew the ridges, the streams, the old fence lines. He should have recognized something, anything. But this felt unfamiliar. Like they had crossed into a place he had never been, or a place no one had been for a long time. "Atlas!" he called, his voice cracking slightly. The dog stopped again, turned, waited. Always waiting. Daniel took a few uneven steps forward, his breathing growing heavier. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, though he knew there would be no answer. Atlas held his gaze for a second longer, then turned again, and continued deeper. The storm intensified. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. 10 feet ahead became 5. 5 became 3. Daniel had to rely on the faint outline of Atlas's body just to keep moving forward. Without it, he would have been blind. His legs began to tremble, not from fear, from exhaustion. Each step felt heavier than the last. His muscles burned, then numbed, then burned again. His thoughts slowed, edges softening, focus slipping. A dangerous place. He knew that too. This was where men made mistakes, small ones, the kind you didn't recover from. He stopped again, leaning heavily against a tree, his head dropping forward. "I can't keep," he started, his voice barely audible. Atlas came back immediately, closer this time, pressing against him, solid, warm despite the cold. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. Just a second. The silence inside his head crept in, tempting. It would be easy. To sit, to rest, just for a moment. He slid down the trunk of the tree slightly, his knees bending. Atlas barked, sharp, loud, right in front of him. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The dog stood there, ears forward, body tense. Not panicked, insistent. "No," Daniel muttered weakly. Just a second." Atlas stepped closer. Then, without hesitation, he grabbed the fabric of Daniel's coat between his teeth and pulled, hard. The motion surprised him enough to jolt him forward. "Hey!" Daniel stumbled, catching himself again. Atlas didn't let go. He pulled again. Daniel stared at him, breath heavy, heart pounding. The message was clear. Move, now. Daniel swallowed hard, pushing himself upright. "All right," he said, voice strained. "All right. I'm moving." Atlas released the coat immediately, stepped back, turned, and kept going. The terrain shifted again. The ground sloped upward this time, forcing Daniel to climb through deeper drifts of snow that reached almost to his knees. Each step was a struggle. Each breath came sharper than the last. The wind howled louder here, rushing over the ridge, carrying with it a cold that cut deeper, more biting than before. Daniel's vision blurred at the edges. Not from snow, from fatigue, from something else. He blinked hard, trying to focus. Atlas was still there, still moving, still leading. That didn't change. Nothing else made sense. But that did. And for some reason, that was enough to keep him going. Then suddenly, Atlas stopped. Completely. Daniel took another step before realizing it, nearly colliding with him. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The dog didn't move, didn't look back, just stood there, still. Daniel forced his eyes forward, squinting through the storm. At first, he saw nothing, just white, endless white. Then, a shape, faint, barely visible, something darker against the snow. Daniel frowned, taking a step closer. But the wind shifted again, just enough to clear the view for a split second. And there it was. Not a tree, not a rock. Something man-made. His heart skipped. "What is that?" he whispered. Atlas took one step forward, then stopped again. Waiting. Daniel's pulse quickened, adrenaline cutting through the exhaustion just enough to sharpen his focus. A structure. Old. Half-buried. Standing alone in the middle of nowhere. Daniel stared at it. Confusion and disbelief mixing with something else he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A small, fragile thing, but real. He looked down at Atlas. The dog didn't move, didn't celebrate, didn't react. He simply stood there, as if he had known it would be there all along. And in that moment, Daniel realized something that sent a chill deeper than the cold ever could. They hadn't just stumbled onto this place. Atlas had led him here, on purpose. The thought didn't feel real. It didn't belong to the world Daniel understood, the world where storms erased direction, where men got lost, where survival came down to luck and endurance. Dogs didn't lead you to shelter in the middle of nowhere. Not like this. Not with certainty. But the shape in front of him was real. A cabin. Old. Weather-beaten. Half-buried in snow, its roof sagging under the weight of years and winters that had come and gone without anyone to clear them. The wood was darkened, almost black in places, as if it had been standing there longer than it should have. Waiting. Daniel took a step forward, his legs trembling under him. The wind pushed hard against his back, as if trying to drive him into it, or maybe knock him away. But he couldn't tell anymore. His mind had started to drift, thoughts slipping through his grasp like something fragile and breaking apart. Focus. He needed to focus. Atlas moved ahead first, approaching the cabin without hesitation. He circled once, nose low, scanning the snow-covered ground, then stopped near the front. There was no path, no tracks, nothing to show anyone had been there recently. Or at all. Daniel reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the structure. A part of him didn't trust it. Didn't trust anything anymore. Places like this didn't just appear, not in storms, not in the middle of nowhere. But the cold didn't care what he believed. It pressed in harder, wrapping around him, stealing what little warmth he had left. But his fingers burned now, not numb anymore. Burning. He knew that stage. He had seen it before. He didn't have much time. "All right," he whispered to himself, though his voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "All right, just get inside." He forced his legs to move. Each step was heavier than the last, boots sinking deep into the snow as he pushed toward the door. The cabin loomed closer. Details came into focus. A broken window, partially boarded up. A porch that had collapsed on one side, buried beneath layers of ice. The door, slightly open. Daniel stopped again. His breath caught in his throat. The door wasn't shut. It wasn't sealed by snow or frozen in place. It was open, just enough to let darkness spill out from inside. A strange stillness surrounded it, while even the wind seemed to quiet for a moment, swirling around the cabin instead of crashing directly into it. Daniel stared at the gap. "Someone's been here," he muttered. But something about that didn't feel right either. There were no tracks, no signs, nothing leading in, nothing leading out. Atlas stepped onto the porch, or what remained of it, and nudged the door with his nose. It creaked, a long, low sound that seemed too loud in the silence. Daniel flinched. Then the wind surged again, reminding him exactly where he was. Outside meant death. Inside, at least, meant a chance. He swallowed hard and stepped forward. The porch shifted under his weight, wood groaning beneath the snow, but it held. Barely. He reached the door and pushed it open wider. The hinges resisted at first, stiff with age, and then gave with a sharp crack. Cold air rushed inside. Or maybe it rushed out. For a second, Daniel couldn't tell which. Then he stepped across the threshold. The change was immediate. The wind vanished. Not completely, but enough. The constant roar dropped to a distant howl outside the walls, muted, like it belonged to another world. Inside, the air was still. Cold, yes, but different, contained. Daniel leaned against the doorframe for a moment, catching his breath, letting his body adjust. Atlas moved past him, stepping lightly across the wooden floor, his claws clicking softly in the quiet. The sound echoed, too clearly, like the cabin hadn't heard footsteps in a long time. Daniel closed the door behind him, pushing it until it latched. The outside disappeared, just like that. Silence. Real silence. While he stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, heart still racing from the storm. Then slowly, he looked around. The cabin was small. One main room, a fireplace on the far wall, a table near the center, covered in dust but otherwise untouched, shelves lined with objects he couldn't make out yet in the dim light. Nothing overturned, nothing broken, nothing disturbed. It didn't look abandoned. It looked paused, like someone had walked out one day and never come back. Daniel took a step forward, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Atlas moved ahead, sniffing along the edges of the room, checking corners, alert but calm. That calmness spread, slowly. Against all logic, Daniel felt it, a faint sense of safety. His body reacted before his mind could question it, and he dropped his pack onto the floor with a dull thud. His hands shook as he pulled off his gloves, fingers stiff, red, barely responding. He flexed them slowly, wincing at the sharp sting as sensation returned. Pain meant circulation. Pain meant he wasn't gone yet. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I made it," he whispered. The words sounded fragile, uncertain, like he didn't quite believe them himself. Atlas returned to his side, sitting down heavily, his sides rising and falling from the effort. Daniel looked at him. Really looked at him now. Snow clung to his fur. Ice had formed along the edges of his coat. His paws. Daniel's eyes narrowed. There was blood. Not much, but enough. "You're hurt," Daniel said, his voice tightening. Atlas didn't react, didn't whine, didn't pull away, and he just sat there, steady, as if the pain didn't matter. Daniel shook his head slightly, something tightening in his chest again, but different this time. Not despair, something else. "Yeah," he murmured. "You got me here." He reached out slowly, brushing snow from the dog's fur, checking his leg. The wound wasn't deep, but it was real, and it had happened out there, while Atlas had been leading him. Daniel swallowed hard. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Atlas looked up at him, and for a brief moment, it felt like he was answering. The cold was still there. Inside the cabin, it crept along the floor, up the walls, settling into everything. But it wasn't killing him anymore. Not yet. Daniel forced himself to move. Focus. Fire. That was what he needed next. He turned toward the fireplace, stepping carefully across the room. The stone structure looked intact, old but solid. Ash still rested inside, gray and untouched, as if it had been left mid-use. He crouched down, brushing the ash aside. There. Old wood. Dry. Impossible. He frowned, picking up a piece, turning it in his hand. Dry. After all these years, after all this time, it shouldn't have been. But it was. He didn't question it, didn't have the energy to. He just worked. Slow, careful, hands still shaking as he arranged the pieces, striking a match from the small kit in his pocket. The first attempt failed. The second sparked weakly. The third caught. A small flame. Flickering. Fragile, but alive. Daniel leaned back slightly, watching it grow, the light spreading slowly across the room, pushing back the shadows inch by inch. Warmth followed. Well, not much, but enough. Enough to keep him here. Enough to keep him breathing. Atlas moved closer, lying down beside the fireplace, his body curling slightly, conserving heat. Daniel sat back against the wall, exhaustion finally crashing over him like a wave. His head dropped forward, his eyes closed. Just for a second, just to rest. The fire crackled softly. The wind howled outside, and somewhere between the two, Daniel Mercer hovered on the edge, not quite safe, not quite lost, but closer to something he hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to make it through the night. The fire didn't burn strong, not at first. It flickered low, casting uneven light across the cabin walls, shadows stretching and pulling like something alive. The warmth it gave off was small and fragile, barely enough to push back the cold that still clung to the room. But it was enough. Enough to keep Daniel from slipping any further. Enough to hold him here. He sat there, back against the wall, eyes half closed, watching the flames rise and fall. Every crackle of the wood felt louder than it should have. echoing in the quiet like a heartbeat slowly finding its rhythm again. Atlas lay beside him, breathing heavy but steady, alive. Daniel's gaze drifted across the room again. Now that there was light, he could see more. And the more he saw, the less it made sense. Nothing in the cabin looked abandoned. Dust had settled, yes, but lightly, as if time had passed without disturbance, not decay. The table stood upright, a chair tucked neatly beside it. A small metal cup rested near the edge, untouched. On the far wall, some shelves held items placed with care. A lantern, a folded blanket, a few books. Not scattered, not forgotten, arranged. Daniel frowned slightly. "Someone lived here," he said quietly. His voice sounded strange in the stillness. Too loud, too present. Atlas lifted his head slightly, ears twitching, then settled again. Daniel pushed himself up slowly, his muscles protesting as he moved. His legs felt weak, unsteady, but they held. He stepped closer to the table, ran his fingers lightly across the surface. Dust clung to his skin, but beneath it, the wood was solid, well kept, not rotted, not worn down. That wasn't right. A cabin like this, out here exposed to years of weather, should have been falling apart. But it wasn't. It stood. Quiet. Intact. Waiting. Daniel turned slowly, scanning the room with sharper focus now. There were details he hadn't noticed before. A coat hanging near the door, stiff with age but still in place. A pair of boots beneath it, lined up carefully, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment. A photograph, half hidden on a shelf near the fireplace. Daniel stepped toward it, picked it up. The glass was cloudy, edges worn, but the image inside was still visible. A man. Standing straight, wearing a military uniform. Beside him, a woman. Smiling. Daniel's chest tightened. The man looked young, strong, confident in that quiet way soldiers carried themselves. The woman leaned slightly toward him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. There was something in her expression, not just happiness, something deeper, something certain. Well, Daniel stared at it longer than he meant to, then slowly set it back. "Who were you?" he murmured. No answer came. Only the fire behind him, shifting, alive in a way the rest of the cabin wasn't. A sound pulled his attention. Soft. Barely there. Daniel turned sharply. Atlas was on his feet now, moving slowly along the far wall, nose low, scanning, alert again. Daniel followed his gaze. There was nothing obvious. No movement, no sound. Just the quiet weight of the cabin pressing in from all sides. "Easy," Daniel said under his breath. Atlas paused, then looked back at him. For a moment the tension eased, but it didn't disappear. Something about this place. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't normal either. Daniel stepped closer to the shelves, inspecting the items more carefully. The books were old, leather-bound, and titles faded beyond recognition. He pulled one free, opening it gently. The pages were yellowed, but intact. No mold, no water damage. Impossible. He flipped through a few pages, then closed it again, setting it back exactly where he found it. Everything here had been left, on purpose, not abandoned, preserved. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The wind howled outside, slamming against the walls, rattling the cabin slightly. For a moment, Daniel wondered how something this old could still stand against a storm like that. But it did. It held. Just like everything else in here. Unchanged. He moved toward the window, wiping away frost with the back of his hand. Outside was nothing but white. Endless, blinding white. The world had disappeared. No trees, no sky, just storm. Daniel stared out at it, a strange thought settling in his mind. If this cabin hadn't been here, he would be gone. No question, no doubt. The cold would have taken him, quietly, completely. He swallowed hard. His reflection faintly appeared in the glass. A stranger looked back at him, eyes hollow, face drawn, a man worn down to the edges. For a second, he didn't recognize himself. Then Atlas moved beside him, pressing gently against his leg. Daniel looked down. The dog's presence grounded him again. Real. Solid. Here. He exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said under his breath. We made it. But even as he said it, his eyes drifted back to the room, to the photo, to the coat, to the boots, to the fire that shouldn't have had dry wood waiting, to the door that had been slightly open, as if someone had known, and as if someone had expected. Daniel's chest tightened. This place, he whispered. He didn't finish the thought, because he didn't know how. Atlas moved again, this time toward the corner of the room, near a small wooden cabinet Daniel hadn't noticed before. The dog sniffed at it, then pawed lightly once. Daniel hesitated, then stepped closer. The cabinet was simple, old, but like everything else, intact. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering over the handle for a moment before gripping it. A strange hesitation held him there. Not fear. Something else. Respect. Like he was about to open something that hadn't been touched in a very long time. He pulled it open. The hinges creaked softly. Inside. More items. Carefully placed. A folded piece of fabric, a small tin box, and beneath them, something thicker, on a book. Daniel reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. Worn, edges frayed, but held together. A journal. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb brushing lightly over the cover. Atlas sat beside him now, watching. Waiting. Daniel exhaled slowly, then opened it. The first page cracked slightly as it unfolded. Handwritten words filled the paper. Neat, careful, deliberate. He read the first line, and everything else in the room seemed to fade away. For the first time since stepping inside, Daniel Mercer realized he wasn't alone in this story, and whatever had happened in this cabin had been waiting a long time to be found. The fire behind him cracked softly, a steady rhythm in the quiet, but Daniel barely heard it now. His eyes were locked on the page. The handwriting was careful, patient. Each letter formed with intention, like the person writing it had believed, had known, someone would read it someday. He swallowed, his throat dry despite the warmth beginning to creep back into his body. Then he read, December 3rd, 1951. The snow came early this year. Henry said he would be home before it got bad. I still believe him. Daniel blinked slowly. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the journal. That wasn't just old. That was a lifetime ago. He turned the page carefully. The paper resisted slightly, stiff with age, but it held. December 9th. The road is gone now. I tried to walk down to the ridge, but the wind turned me back. I will stay here. He knows this place. He will come. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. A quiet, uncomfortable pressure. He leaned back slightly, his shoulder brushing the wall, the journal still open in his hands. Atlas remained beside him, silent, watchful, always watchful. Daniel turned another page. December 15th. It has been 2 weeks since I last saw anyone. The town must think I've left, but I cannot. If Henry comes back and I am not here, he will have nowhere to go. Daniel's jaw tightened. The firelight flickered, casting shadows across the words, making them seem almost alive as they moved slightly with the shifting flame. He kept reading. Each entry was short, simple, but they carried weight. Days turned into weeks, weeks into silence. December 20th. I heard something outside tonight. I thought it was him. I opened the door, but it was only the wind. I will keep the fire ready, just in case. Daniel's eyes drifted unconsciously toward the fireplace. The wood. Dry. Waiting. His breath slowed. That didn't make sense. Not after all this time. Not after all these years. And yet, he looked back down at the page. The answer sat there in ink, waiting, just like everything else. A sound pulled him back. Soft, a low whine. Daniel turned his head. Atlas. The dog had shifted closer to the fire. His body curled slightly, but his ears were back now. His attention no longer on the room, but on Daniel. On him. "You okay?" Daniel asked quietly. The question felt strange. He wasn't used to asking it. Atlas didn't respond, but his eyes didn't leave Daniel's. Daniel gave a small exhale. "Yeah, I know." He shifted his position, pulling the journal closer, leaning forward slightly as he turned another page. The handwriting changed here, not in style, but in pressure. Oh, heavier, less steady. December 24th. The storm has not stopped. I cannot feel my fingers most mornings. The fire keeps me here. I will not leave. If he comes home, he must find me. Daniel's chest tightened. Christmas Eve. He glanced toward the door instinctively. Outside, the storm raged on. Different time. Same cold. Same waiting. He looked back down. December 25th. Merry Christmas, Henry. I made coffee this morning, just like you like it. I left your cup on the table. It will be warm when you arrive. Daniel's breath caught. His eyes flicked toward the table. The metal cup still there, unmoved. He stared at it for a long moment, then back to the journal. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the next page. The writing had grown thinner now, fainter. December 27th. I dreamed you came home, but you were standing in the doorway, covered in snow. I woke up before I could reach you. Daniel swallowed hard. Something inside him was shifting, something he didn't want to name. He turned another page, slower this time. December 30th. I will stay, no matter how long it takes. I promised you I would be here. The words pressed into him, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. Daniel leaned back again, his head resting briefly against the wall. His eyes closed for a second, and in that second, he saw Claire, standing in their kitchen, smiling, alive. He opened his eyes quickly. The cabin returned. The fire, the journal, Atlas. But the feeling stayed. Heavy, uncomfortable, familiar. You stayed, Daniel murmured, his voice low. He didn't know if he was speaking to the woman in the journal or to himself. Atlas shifted again, moving closer until his body pressed lightly against Daniel's leg, grounding him, keeping him here. Daniel let out a slow breath. then looked down again. The last pages remained. He hesitated. Something told him. These mattered, more than the others. He turned the next page carefully. The handwriting was faint now, barely there, but still readable. January 2nd. The fire is harder to keep now. I am so tired, but I will not leave. If he comes, he will not be alone. Daniel's throat tightened. He blinked slowly, forcing himself to keep reading. January 4th. I hear the wind less now. Maybe it has stopped. Or maybe I am just too tired to notice. I am not afraid. The fire popped behind him, a sharp sound in the quiet. Daniel flinched slightly, then steadied himself. One more page. Just one. But his fingers hesitated on the edge, then turned it. The last entry. The ink was faint, almost gone, but the words were still there. I will wait here, Henry, however long it takes. Even if it is the last thing I do, you will find me. Daniel didn't move, didn't breathe. The room felt different now, heavier, full, like something had just been said out loud after years of silence. His eyes drifted slowly back to the table, the cup, to the coat by the door, to the boots. Everything exactly where it had been left. Waiting. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Waiting. Daniel's grip tightened on the journal. A thought formed. Clear. Unavoidable. She never left. The words came out barely above a whisper. Atlas lifted his head slightly. Daniel shook his head slowly, his chest tightening again, but this time as it wasn't from the cold. She stayed, all the way to the end. His voice cracked slightly, and in that moment, Daniel Mercer understood something he hadn't allowed himself to face in a long time. This wasn't just a story about a woman waiting for someone who never came home. It was something else, something closer, something sharper. Because sitting there in that cabin, surrounded by the life she had refused to leave behind, Daniel realized he had been doing the same thing, just in a different way, holding on, not moving, not living, waiting for something that wasn't coming back. The fire flickered. Atlas pressed closer, and for the first time since stepping into the storm, Daniel didn't feel lost. He felt seen by someone who had been gone for decades. Yes, and somehow still understood him better than anyone else ever had. The thought didn't sit lightly. It settled deep. Deeper than the cold. Deeper than the exhaustion. It pressed into Daniel's chest in a way he hadn't felt in years. Quiet, heavy, impossible to ignore. He stared down at the final page of the journal, the faint ink almost disappearing into the paper. I will wait here, Henry, however long it takes. Daniel closed the book slowly, carefully, as if anything sudden might disturb something that had been held together for decades. The cabin felt different now, not empty, not abandoned, occupied, not by a person, but by something that remained. A presence made of memory, of choice, of waiting. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the journal still in his hands. His breath came slower now, steadier. But his mind was no longer quiet. Claire's face came back again, clearer this time. Standing in the doorway of their home, sunlight behind her, smiling like nothing in the world could touch them. You're late, she had said once, hands on her hips, pretending to be annoyed. Daniel had laughed, actually laughed. He could still hear it, And that was the part that hurt the most, because he hadn't laughed like that since. Not once. The memory shifted. The hospital. The call. The long flight back that felt like it would never end. And then, the silence. Daniel shut his eyes tight, his jaw clenching. "No," he muttered under his breath. But it didn't stop. The memories didn't listen anymore. They came when they wanted, stayed as long as they wanted, and left him worse every time. Atlas moved beside him again, pressing his body gently against Daniel's side, grounding him, pulling him back. Daniel opened his eyes slowly, staring at the fire. The flames danced, small but steady, alive, still alive. He let out a long breath, then looked down at the journal again. "She waited," he said quietly. Atlas didn't move, didn't react, but his presence was enough. Daniel ran his hand over the cover of the book, his fingers tracing the worn edges. "All that time," he continued, "she stayed." The words felt heavier now, more personal, more dangerous. Because he knew what came next. He had to say it, even if he didn't want to. And he never came back. The silence that followed was deeper than anything before. The fire cracked softly. The wind howled faintly beyond the walls. But inside, there was only truth. Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, his chest tighter. He leaned back against the wall again, his head tilting slightly as he stared at the ceiling. "I did the same thing," he said, after a long moment. The words came out slow, reluctant, but real. Atlas lifted his head slightly. Daniel gave a small, bitter breath. Not like her, but close enough. His eyes drifted toward the door, the coat, the boots, everything left exactly where it had been. "I stayed in that house, like she stayed here," he said. "Didn't move, didn't change anything." His voice lowered. "Didn't let anything go." The admission hung in the air, unanswered, unchallenged, but undeniable. Daniel closed his eyes again, this time not to escape, but to face it. "I thought if I stayed," he continued slowly, "if I didn't touch anything, didn't move forward," his voice faltered, "then somehow she wouldn't be gone." The words broke slightly at the end. He pressed his lips together, breathing uneven for a moment. Atlas shifted closer again, resting his head lightly against Daniel's leg. Daniel looked down at him. There was no judgment in those eyes, no expectation, just presence. Steady, constant. "Here." Daniel reached out, his hand resting on Atlas's neck, fingers pressing lightly into his fur. Warm. Real, alive. "You didn't let me stay there," Daniel said quietly. Atlas's ears twitched slightly. "You kept pulling me out," he continued, "even when I didn't want to move." The memory of earlier returned sharply. The pull on his coat, the insistence, the refusal to let him sit down in the snow, and Daniel's grip tightened slightly. "You wouldn't let me quit." The realization settled in, clear, simple, unavoidable. Atlas hadn't just been following him into the storm. He had been leading him out of something deeper than snow, deeper than cold. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just a little. Then his eyes drifted back to the journal, to the story that had been waiting for him. "She stayed for him," he said softly. A pause. "And you didn't stay with me." Atlas looked up at him. Daniel shook his head slightly, a faint, almost broken smile touching his lips. "No," he corrected himself. "You stayed, but you didn't let me stay stuck." The difference mattered, more than anything else. Daniel leaned forward again, placing the journal gently on the table this time, next to the metal cup, and he didn't tuck it away, didn't hide it. He left it where it could be seen, where it had always been meant to be found. The fire burned a little stronger now, warmth spreading further into the room. The cold still lingered, but it no longer controlled everything. Daniel sat there in the shifting light, the storm still raging outside, the past still heavy inside him. But something had changed. Not completely, not enough to fix everything, but enough. Enough to make a difference. Enough to shift the direction. He looked down at Atlas again. The dog was watching him, as always. Waiting. Daniel let out a slow breath. "All right," he said quietly. The word didn't carry strength. Not yet. But it carried something else. A beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Mercer didn't feel like he was just waiting for something to end. He felt like he might still have something left to live for. The thought lingered longer than Daniel expected. Not loud, not overwhelming, just there. Like a small flame, steady, quiet, refusing to go out. He sat in front of the fire, watching it breathe, rise and fall, crackle and settle. The cabin held its silence around him, no longer heavy, but not empty either. Atlas hadn't moved far. Still close. Still watching. Daniel leaned back against the wall, his body finally beginning to relax after hours of tension. The warmth had started to seep into his bones, slow but real. His fingers had regained feeling. The sharp sting of returning circulation had faded into a dull ache. Alive. Still here. And he let his head rest back, eyes drifting shut for just a moment. Just a moment. The dream came fast. Too fast. The desert. Heat pressing down. The sound of boots on gravel. Voices shouting. Distant. Urgent. Then the shift. The road. Rain. Headlights cutting through darkness. A flash. Metal. Glass. The sound. Daniel's eyes snapped open. His breath came sharp, uneven, chest tightening as if something invisible had wrapped around him again. "No," he whispered, his voice raw. The cabin returned slowly. The fire, the walls, the quiet. Atlas was already moving. The dog stepped closer, pressing firmly against Daniel's side, grounding him, steadying his breath before it could spiral further. Daniel closed his eyes again, but this time not to escape, to steady, to breathe. "I'm here," he said under his breath, as if reminding himself. Atlas didn't move away, didn't let him drift. He stayed, always stayed. A sudden sound broke the moment. A sharp gust slammed into the side of the cabin, rattling the walls, making the entire structure groan under the force. Daniel's eyes opened immediately. The storm. It hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown worse. The fire flickered hard for a second, shadows jumping across the walls. Atlas turned toward the door, ears up now, body alert. Then, another sound. Fainter. Outside. Daniel frowned slightly. What was that? He pushed himself up slowly, his legs still weak but holding. He stepped carefully toward the door, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. Atlas moved ahead of him, faster now, focused. Daniel reached the door and paused. The wind roared just beyond it. pressing against the wood, slipping through the cracks. He hesitated, then slowly pulled it open. The storm hit instantly. Cold air surged inside, biting, aggressive, stealing the warmth in seconds. Daniel squinted into the white. "Hello?" he called out, though he knew it was pointless. The wind swallowed the word before it could travel. Nothing. No movement. No shape. Just endless snow and chaos. He stepped forward slightly, scanning left, then right. Atlas moved past him, out into the storm. "Hey!" Daniel called, but the dog didn't stop. Atlas pushed through the snow, moving a few yards from the cabin before stopping abruptly. He lowered his head, then pawed at the ground. Daniel frowned. "What are you?" Atlas barked. Short, sharp, urgent. Daniel stepped out fully now, the cold hitting him again, and harder this time. "What is it?" he said, forcing himself forward through the snow. Atlas kept pawing, digging now, faster. Daniel reached him, dropping to one knee despite the cold, brushing snow aside with his hands. Something was there. Hard. Buried. His fingers hit wood. A box. Small. Partially covered. Daniel cleared the rest quickly, pulling it free from the snow. The lid was stiff, frozen slightly, but it gave under pressure. Inside. Cloth. Folded. Wrapped carefully. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he opened it. A scarf. Wool. Old. But preserved. He froze. Atlas whined softly beside him. Daniel stared at the fabric, then slowly lifted it. The cold didn't touch it the way it should have. It was protected, like everything else. He turned it over in his hands, and then he saw it, at a small stitched detail in the corner. Initials, H.W. Henry Whitaker. Daniel's chest tightened. He looked back toward the cabin, then down at the scarf again. "She brought it out here," he whispered. Atlas stood close now, watching him, waiting. Daniel's mind raced, piecing it together. The journal, the waiting, the promise. She hadn't just stayed inside. She had come out, into the storm, looking, searching, hoping. His grip tightened slightly on the scarf. "She didn't give up," he said quietly. The wind howled around them, but the words held. For a moment Daniel stayed there, kneeling in the snow, the past and present colliding in a way that felt too real, too close. Then Atlas nudged him, firm, insistent. Daniel looked at him. The message was clear. "Get back inside. Now." Daniel nodded once, pushing himself up, clutching the scarf as he moved back toward the cabin. The cold bit harder now, stronger, like it had been waiting. He stumbled once, catching himself against the doorframe as he stepped inside. Atlas followed immediately, shaking off snow, moving quickly back toward the fire. Daniel shut the door, sealing the storm out once more. Silence returned. Warmth returned. But something else came with him this time. He stood there for a moment, staring down at the scarf in his hands. A piece of someone's last hope. Left behind. Buried. But not lost. He moved slowly back to the fire, sitting down heavily, placing the scarf carefully beside him. Atlas lay down again, closer than before, his breathing still heavy, his body tense despite the warmth. Daniel noticed it now, really noticed it, and the way Atlas shifted slightly, the way he favored one leg. Daniel leaned forward. "Let me see," he said quietly. Atlas didn't resist. Daniel reached out gently, lifting the dog's paw. The cut was deeper than he had thought. Not life-threatening, but not nothing either. "You did this out there," Daniel murmured, his voice tightening. Atlas remained still, trusting. Daniel swallowed hard. "You kept going anyway." The realization hit deeper now. Atlas hadn't just led him here. He had pushed through pain to do it. Daniel let out a slow breath, his hand resting gently against the dog's leg. "You wouldn't let me stop," he said. Atlas's eyes met his, steady, unwavering. Daniel gave a small, tired shake of his head. "No matter what." He leaned back slightly, the fire warming his face, the scarf resting beside him, the dog at his side. Outside, the storm continued its endless assault. Inside, something else held. Stronger, quieter, more stubborn than the cold. Daniel looked down at Atlas one more time, and for the first time, he understood it completely. This wasn't just loyalty. This wasn't just instinct. Atlas wasn't staying because he had nowhere else to go. He was staying because he had chosen to. Because no matter how far Daniel had fallen, no matter how close he had come to giving up, Atlas had already made his decision. He wasn't going anywhere. Not then. Not now. Not ever. And somehow, that was enough to keep Daniel from letting go. The fire burned steadier now, not strong enough to chase the cold from every corner of the cabin, but strong enough to hold the line. Daniel sat there, and one hand resting lightly on Atlas's side, feeling the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing. Each rise and fall grounded him, kept him present, kept him from slipping back into the quiet place he had lived in for too long. The scarf lay beside him, the journal on the table, two pieces of a life that had ended, and somehow reached across time to touch his. He didn't understand it. Didn't need to. Not anymore. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, Daniel Mercer had made it through the night. Miles away, back near the edge of the forest, the search had stopped. For now. Sheriff Dalton Hayes stood beside the last truck, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the dark wall of trees ahead. The storm hadn't eased. If anything, it had settled in, thick, relentless, refusing to give them even a moment of mercy. And Carl Benson approached from behind, his boots crunching through the snow. "Teams are back," he said quietly. "Everyone accounted for." Dalton nodded once. "Any sign?" Carl shook his head. "Nothing. Not a track. Not a piece of gear. It's like he just vanished." Dalton's jaw tightened. He'd seen bad situations before. People lost. People hurt. But this was different. This was the kind of night where the land didn't just hide you. It took you. Carl hesitated before speaking again. "Sheriff, we need to call it." Dalton didn't respond immediately. The words hung there, heavy, final. Carl shifted his weight slightly. "You know what this storm is doing out there. We push any further tonight, we risk losing more people." Dalton exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the freezing air. He knew Carl was right, but he knew it the moment the wind had picked up, the moment visibility dropped to nothing, the moment even the most experienced men on his team started second-guessing every step. Still, his eyes drifted back to the forest, to where Atlas had stood, to the way the dog had looked at them, not panicked, not lost, certain. Dalton frowned slightly. "That dog," he said quietly. Carl glanced at him. "What about him?" Dalton shook his head once, more to himself than anything else. "I've seen dogs track before," he said. "I've seen them search. I've seen them panic when they lose a scent." He paused. "But I've never seen one like that." Carl didn't answer, because he had seen it too. The way Atlas had moved, the way he had looked at them, not asking for help, not confused, leading. Dalton rubbed a hand over his face. It's the cold biting at his skin. "We pull back for the night," he said finally. Carl nodded slowly. Relief flickered across his face, but it was mixed with something else, something heavier. "What about tomorrow?" he asked. Dalton looked out at the trees again. The storm, the darkness, the unknown. "We go back in at first light," he said. A pause. "If the storm lets us." Morning didn't come gently. It came slow. Gray. The sky still heavy with clouds, the storm weakened, but not gone. The wind had dropped just enough to reveal shapes again. Trees, ridges, the faint outlines of a world that had been completely erased hours before. Dalton stood at the edge of the forest once more, scanning the land. Everything had changed. Snow had buried old trails, covered markers, shifted the terrain just enough to make even familiar ground feel foreign. Carl joined him again, holding a map in one hand. "We've already covered most of this area," he said, pointing. "If he kept moving north." He didn't finish. Dalton nodded slowly. "Then we missed him." The words tasted bitter. Carl hesitated. "We could expand the search. Push further out." Dalton shook his head slightly. "In this terrain? After a storm like that?" he said. "We'd be guessing." A long silence followed. Then, a voice called out from behind them. "Sheriff!" Dalton turned. One of the younger volunteers jogged toward them, breathing hard. "You need to see this." Dalton's expression sharpened instantly. "What is it?" The man pointed toward the far edge of the clearing. "We found tracks." Dalton's heart skipped once. What kind of tracks?" "Dog," the man said. "Big one." "Atlas." Dalton didn't wait. He moved fast, pushing through the snow toward the edge of the clearing. Carl followed close behind. The tracks were faint, partially filled in by wind. But there, large, deep, fresh. Dalton crouched slightly, studying them. "They're heading north," Carl said quietly. Dalton nodded. "But look at the pattern." Carl frowned. "What do you mean?" Dalton pointed. "See how straight they are?" he said. "No circling, no hesitation, just forward." Carl looked again and saw it. A straight line. Through terrain no animal should have been able to navigate cleanly in a storm like that. "That doesn't make sense," Carl said. "No," Dalton agreed. "It doesn't." He stood slowly, his eyes following the direction of the tracks. North, not deeper into the forest, deeper into territory no one had searched yet. Carl shifted uneasily. "You really think—" "I don't know what I think," Dalton cut in. A pause. Then more quietly, "But that dog knows something." The wind moved through the trees again, softer now, carrying with it a strange stillness. Dalton looked out at the untouched snow ahead. A place no one had gone, a place no one had checked. And suddenly, a thought surfaced. Faint, but persistent. "There used to be something out there," he said. Carl frowned. "What?" Dalton narrowed his eyes slightly, searching his memory. "Old cabin," he said slowly. "Way back, before my time. Haven't heard anyone mention it in years." Carl blinked. "A cabin? Out there?" Dalton nodded once. "If it's still standing." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. When Carl looked at the tracks again, then back at Dalton. "This could be it," he said quietly. Dalton exhaled slowly. The weight of the decision settled on him. This was it. One last direction, one last chance. If they were wrong, they would be chasing ghosts, but if they were right. He didn't let himself finish that thought. He turned to the rest of the team. "We move out," he said, his voice firm again. "Follow the tracks. Stay tight. No one breaks formation." Carl nodded, already signaling the others. Dalton took one last look at the path ahead, at the tracks cutting through untouched snow, at the unknown waiting beyond. Then he stepped forward, and for the first time since the storm began, they weren't searching blindly anymore. They were following something, or someone, who didn't want to be lost. The forest felt different now. Not quieter, not safer. Just aware. Sheriff Dalton Hayes moved at the front of the line, his eyes locked on the faint trail ahead. The tracks weren't easy to follow. Snow had already begun to reclaim them, softening the edges, filling the deeper impressions. But they were still there. Clear enough. Deliberate. The team moved carefully, step by step, keeping close, their breaths forming clouds in the cold morning air. No one spoke unless they had to. The weight of what they might find pressed into every movement, every decision. Carl stayed just behind Dalton, glancing between the tracks and the trees. "You really think he made it this far?" he asked quietly. Dalton didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed forward. "I think that dog did," he said finally. Carl frowned. And Mercer?" Dalton exhaled slowly. "I don't know." The honesty in that answer settled heavily between them. They kept moving. The terrain shifted gradually as they pushed deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, older, their branches heavy with snow. The ground dipped and rose unpredictably, forcing the team to adjust their pace. Then, Dalton slowed, raised a hand. The group stopped instantly. "What is it?" Carl asked. Dalton didn't respond. He was looking ahead, through the trees, at something that didn't belong. A shape. Dark. Still. Partially hidden behind the drifting snow. Dalton took a step forward, then another. The shape became clearer. Lines, edges, structure. Carl's breath caught. "Is that—" Dalton didn't wait for him to finish. He moved faster now, pushing through the snow, with the branches scraping against his coat as he closed the distance. And then, they saw it. The cabin, standing alone, half buried, exactly where it shouldn't have been. For a moment, no one spoke. The team gathered behind Dalton, staring at the structure in silence. Carl shook his head slightly. "I didn't think it was real." Dalton's eyes moved across the cabin slowly. The roof, the walls, the door, closed, but not sealed. He stepped closer, his heart beginning to beat harder now, not from the cold, but from something else, something sharp, something urgent. "Spread out," he said. "Check for signs." The team moved quickly, circling the structure, scanning the snow. "Sheriff!" one of them called out. Dalton turned. The man pointed toward the ground near the front. "Tracks." Dalton moved closer, crouching slightly. But not just the dog this time. Boot prints, faint, uneven. But there, leading to the door. Carl's voice came from behind him. "He made it." Dalton stood slowly, his eyes locking onto the cabin. For a second, everything else faded. The storm, the cold, the doubt. He stepped forward. "Mercer!" he called out, his voice cutting through the air. No answer. He reached the door, his hand hovering over it for a brief moment. Then he pushed. The hinges groaned. The door swung open. Warm air spilled out. Not strong, but enough. Enough to be felt. Dalton stepped inside. The light from outside cut into the dim cabin, mixing with the glow of a fire still burning in the hearth. Alive. Still alive. Dalton's eyes adjusted quickly, and then he saw him. Daniel Mercer sat slumped against the wall near the fire, while his head tilted slightly, his eyes closed, for a heartbeat. Dalton thought he was too late. "Mercer!" he called, stepping forward quickly. No movement. Carl entered behind him. "Is he—" "Hold on," Dalton said sharply. He dropped to one knee beside Daniel, reaching out, pressing 2 fingers lightly against his neck. A second passed. Then a pulse. Weak, but there. "He's alive," Dalton said, relief cutting through his voice. Carl exhaled sharply. "Thank God." Atlas lifted his head from where he lay beside Daniel, his body barely moving at first. Then slowly, he rose, unsteady, but standing. Dalton looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. The dog watched him. Not aggressive, not defensive, just aware, like he had been waiting for this moment. "You did good," Dalton said quietly. Atlas didn't react, but he turned his head slightly, looking back at Daniel, always back to him. Carl moved closer, kneeling on the other side. "We need to get him out of here." Dalton nodded. "Easy. Don't rush it." Daniel stirred slightly. A faint movement, a breath. Then his eyes opened, slow, heavy, confused. For a moment he didn't seem to understand where he was, who they were. Then his gaze shifted. To Dalton, to Carl, to the doorway, the light. Reality settling back in. "You found it," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. Dalton frowned slightly. "Found you?" Daniel shook his head weakly. "No," he said. "Not me." His eyes drifted toward the room, the table, the journal, the fire. "This place?" Carl glanced around, confused. "What is this place?" Daniel's lips moved slightly, forming words that barely made it out. "Someone kept it alive." Dalton followed his gaze. The journal, the cup, the coat, everything untouched, everything waiting. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold outside. He looked back at Daniel. "Can you stand?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes moved again. This time to Atlas. The dog stood beside him, steady despite the injury, his body close. Daniel's hand shifted slightly, brushing against the dog's side. "I'm here," he murmured. Atlas leaned into the touch. Dalton watched the exchange for a second, then nodded once. "All right," he said. "We're getting you out." Carl signaled the others. They moved in carefully, supporting Daniel as they lifted him slowly to his feet. He winced slightly, his body weak, unsteady, but he stayed upright. Atlas stayed close, well, never more than a step away. As they guided Daniel toward the door, he paused, just for a moment. His eyes moved back across the cabin one last time. The journal, the fire, the life that had been left behind, and somehow still mattered. "Thank you," he whispered. No one asked who he was speaking to. They didn't need to. Then he stepped forward, out into the cold, out of the cabin, out of the place that had kept him alive. The team moved quickly now, wrapping him, securing him, preparing for the return. The storm had eased, but the cold remained. Atlas stepped out last. He paused at the doorway, looked back once, then turned and followed. As the cabin door swung shut behind them, the fire inside flickered quietly, still burning, still waiting, as if it had never been alone at all. The ambulance doors slammed shut against the cold, sealing Daniel and Atlas inside with a rush of sterile warmth and urgency. Red lights pulsed across the snow as the vehicle pulled away from the forest, tires grinding against ice, carrying them back toward a world that had already begun to believe they were gone. Inside, everything felt distant, muted. A medic knelt beside Daniel, checking his pulse, adjusting the oxygen mask gently over his face. "Stay with me, Daniel," she said, her voice calm, steady. He tried to focus on her, tried to anchor himself to something real, but his mind kept drifting, back to the cabin, to the fire, to the journal sitting quietly on that worn wooden table. Atlas lay beside him on the floor, refusing the separate stretcher the medics had prepared. One of them had tried to move him, but the low growl that followed had been enough, so they let him stay. The dog's body trembled slightly, exhaustion catching up now that the danger had passed. Blood matted the fur along his front leg, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on Daniel, always on Daniel. Daniel's fingers moved weakly, brushing against Atlas's head. "I'm still here," he whispered. Atlas didn't move, but his ears twitched. That was enough. The hospital in Riverton had seen its share of winter emergencies, but this one spread through the halls faster than anything else. The man they'd stopped looking for. The one everyone thought the mountain had taken. Alive. By the time Daniel was wheeled into the emergency room, people already knew his name. Doctors moved quickly, voices overlapping, hands working with practiced precision. "Core temps low. Get warm fluids started. Watch for frostbite." Through it all, Daniel drifted in and out of awareness. Lights blurred. Voices echoed. Time lost meaning. But one thing remained constant. Every time his eyes opened, Atlas was there, even when they tried to move him, even when they cleaned his wounds. The dog never left. Not once. Sheriff Dalton stood outside the hospital room hours later, his arms crossed, watching through the glass. Daniel lay in the bed, pale but stable, machines quietly tracking his recovery. Atlas rested on a blanket near the foot of the bed, finally asleep, his breathing slow but steady. Carl stepped up beside him. "Doc says they'll both make it," he said. Dalton nodded once. "That dog," Carl added, shaking his head. "I've seen a lot out there. I've never seen anything like that." Dalton didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on Atlas. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Neither have I." Carl shifted slightly. "What about the cabin?" Dalton glanced at him. "It's real," he said, "and it's been there a long time." Carl hesitated. "You think what he said in there? About someone keeping it alive?" Dalton exhaled slowly. "I don't know what I think," he admitted. "But I know this." He looked back through the glass. That place saved his life. 2 days later, the storm had cleared completely. The sky stretched wide and blue over the mountains, as if nothing had ever happened. But in town, everything felt different. The story had spread, not just about Daniel, but about the cabin, about what had been found inside. The journal. Sheriff Dalton sat at his desk, just turning the worn pages carefully. Eleanor Whitaker's handwriting filled each line, steady at first, then gradually more fragile as the entries moved forward in time. She wrote about waiting, about hope, about love that refused to fade, even when the world moved on without it. Carl leaned against the wall, reading over his shoulder. "She stayed there, all those years?" he asked. Dalton nodded slightly. "Waiting for someone who never came back." Carl frowned. That's a long time to hold on. Dalton's eyes didn't leave the page. Yeah, he said softly. It is. He turned to the last entry. The ink lighter. The words slower, but clear. I will stay where he can find me, even if it takes the rest of my life. Dalton closed the journal gently. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Carl said, You think she ever knew? Dalton looked up. Knew what? That he wasn't coming back. Dalton considered that, then shook his head slightly. I think it didn't matter. Daniel was sitting up when Dalton entered his room later that afternoon. The color had returned to his face, faint but real. Atlas lay beside the bed, his leg bandaged, his head resting on Daniel's knee. Daniel looked up as Dalton approached. You found it, he said quietly. Dalton gave a small nod. We did. Daniel glanced down at Atlas, his hand moving slowly through the dog's fur. He didn't let me stop, he said. Dalton pulled a chair closer, sitting down. That dog kept you alive, he said. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, he said. His eyes lifted. That place did. Dalton studied him. The cabin? Daniel nodded. And the woman who stayed there? Dalton leaned back slightly. You read the journal. Daniel's gaze drifted toward the window. Snow still clung to the edges of the world outside, but sunlight had begun to break through. She waited her whole life, he said. Dalton didn't interrupt. Daniel's voice grew quieter. I thought I understood what it meant to lose everything. He paused. But I was wrong. His hand tightened slightly against Atlas's fur. I was still breathing, he said. Dalton watched him carefully. And now? Daniel looked at Atlas, then back at Dalton. Now, I think I might still have something left. Dalton nodded once. That's a good place to start. Over the next week, the town changed in ways no one had expected. People talked, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant. That the cabin became more than just a place in the woods. It became a story, a reminder of waiting, of survival, of something that refused to be forgotten. Volunteers began talking about restoring it, preserving it, not as a relic, but as something alive, something that still mattered. Daniel listened to it all quietly. He didn't rush, didn't force anything. He spent his days recovering, learning how to sit with silence again, without letting it consume him. Atlas healed slowly. The wound on his leg would leave a scar, but it didn't slow him down. If anything, he stayed closer to Daniel than ever before, always watching, always there. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, Daniel stood outside the hospital for the first time since being brought in. The air was cold, but it didn't feel empty. Atlas stood beside him, his breath visible in the fading light. Daniel looked out toward the distant line of trees. Somewhere out there. The cabin still stood, still waiting, but it didn't feel like a place of endings anymore. Not anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly. I'm not done, he said quietly. Atlas shifted slightly beside him, as if he understood. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel believed it. Not because of the storm, not because of the rescue, but because somewhere in the middle of everything he had lost, he had found something again, something small, something fragile, but real, a reason to keep going. The first snow of the next winter came softer. Not like the storm that had nearly taken everything. This one fell quietly, gently, but covering the mountains in a calm, steady white that felt less like a threat and more like a promise. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the forest, his boots pressing fresh tracks into the untouched snow. Atlas moved beside him, slower now, his old injury still lingering in the cold, but his posture strong, alert, unshaken. They both paused at the same time, because they both knew. They were close. The trees parted just enough to reveal it. The cabin, still there, still standing, exactly as it had been. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. A year ago, this place had been the line between life and death. Now, it felt like something else, something quieter, something sacred. He exhaled slowly, his breath drifting into the cold air. "Hey," a small voice said behind him. Daniel turned, but a young girl stepped carefully through the snow, bundled in a thick winter coat, her boots a size too big, her movements cautious but determined. Lily, his daughter. She stopped beside him, her eyes lifting toward the cabin. "That's it?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "That's it." She studied it for a moment. "It doesn't look like much." A faint smile touched Daniel's face. "No," he said. "It doesn't." Atlas stepped forward first. He always did. His nose lowered, catching familiar scents buried beneath the snow, his tail giving a slow, steady sway. Lily watched him. "He remembers," she said. Daniel followed Atlas with his eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He does." They approached together. The cabin door stood just as it had before, worn, aged, but still intact. Daniel reached out, his hand resting briefly against the wood. Cold, real. Then he pushed it open. The hinges groaned softly. Inside, the air felt still, but not empty. The fire was gone now. Only ash remained in the hearth. But everything else, the table, the chair, the journal, it was all still there, waiting, just like before. Lily stepped in slowly, her eyes moving across the room. "It's like nobody ever left," she whispered. Daniel closed the door behind them, the outside world falling away. "That's because she didn't," he said. Lily turned to him. "Who?" Daniel walked over to the table, his fingers brushing lightly over the worn surface before picking up the journal. He held it carefully, like something fragile. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "She lived here a long time ago." Lily moved closer, her curiosity pulling her in. "What happened to her?" Daniel looked down at the journal, then back at his daughter. "She stayed," he said, "waiting for someone she loved." Lily's expression softened slightly. "Did they come back?" Daniel paused. The silence stretched just long enough to matter. "No," he said gently. "They didn't." Lily frowned slightly. "Then why didn't she leave?" Daniel looked around the cabin, at the walls, the window, the quiet. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "people hold on to love, even when it hurts." Lily didn't respond right away. She stepped closer to Atlas instead, kneeling down beside him, her small hand resting carefully against his side. "He didn't leave you," she said. Daniel watched her. "No," he said. "He didn't." Atlas leaned into her touch, calm and steady. The three of them stood there together, not as strangers to the place anymore, but as something else, something connected. Daniel set the journal back down on the table, then reached into his coat pocket. pulled out a folded piece of paper. He hesitated for a moment, then placed it gently beside the journal. Lily tilted her head. "What's that?" Daniel unfolded it slightly, just enough for her to see the handwriting. A simple message. "I think it's something she deserved to hear," he said. Lily read it quietly, her lips moving as she followed the words. "You waited. I survived. Now I choose to live." She looked up at him. "That's for her?" Daniel nodded. "And for me." The room fell quiet again. But it wasn't heavy, not like before. This silence felt different, full, complete. Atlas moved toward the door, sitting near it, and his gaze drifting out toward the forest beyond the window. Watching. Always watching. Lily followed his gaze. "Do you think she's still here?" she asked softly. Daniel stepped beside her, looked out into the trees, the snow, the stillness. "I think," he said, "some part of her never really left." Lily nodded slowly, as if that made sense in a way words couldn't explain. They stayed a while longer, not talking much, just being there, letting the place speak for itself. Then finally, Daniel placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. They stepped back out into the cold. The door closed behind them, and this time, it didn't feel like something was being left behind. It felt like something had been honored. Atlas lingered 1 second longer than the others, sitting at the threshold, was looking back inside, then forward again, toward the trees, toward the future. Then he stood and followed. Daniel took Lily's hand as they began walking back through the snow. Their footprints stretched behind them, clear and steady, no longer lost, no longer wandering, just moving forward, together. The wind shifted gently through the trees, soft, almost like a whisper, and somewhere, deep in the quiet of the mountains, it felt as though something long unfinished had finally been set to rest. And if this story meant something to you, even just a little, I want you to do something simple. Comment 1 if you believe loyalty like Atlas still exists in this world, or comment 0 if you've ever felt lost, like Daniel once did. No long message needed, just one number. I'll be reading every single one. Now, and if you stayed all the way to the end, you're not just watching stories. You're part of them now. So go ahead, hit subscribe, and come back for the next story. Because out there, somewhere, there's always another story waiting to be found.